Thank you all for being here. I'm in pretty heavy footsteps with the speakers that were here before me and also following Tom Thomson. And I've realized that more and more as I've started his trail. I actually started up here in March of this year when there was still ice on the water and I had to walk his trail rather than canoe it. And Mowat Lodge wasn't open, but luckily Bartlett Lodge gave me a little spot to stay in. So I've got a lot of crossovers that go with him, and I'll speak to a few of them today. What I'm doing is I'm creating 150 paintings that in spots where Tom Thomson was. As many of them will be in the actual spots when I can find them. I found about a dozen so far, and then I know of where some others are, and I keep coming across more. But a lot of the times it'll be that I may not be in the exact same spots, but I know I'm going to be on the canoe routes and the trails that he was on at the time. It started off as an idea last year when I was teaching at Camp Tanamakun, and I was listening to a speech on Tom Thomson and realized that this year is the 100-year anniversary of his time in the park. And I thought, what a great thing for me as a historian. I love history, love nature, and love art, to go and do something like that about going out and just studying the art that he did, not only how he painted it, but what he went through to paint it. Carrying wet canvases around if you're on a 2-week trip, and carrying those canvases around. A lot of people don't think about that. The turpentines and all the things that you have to carry in through the bush to do that on top of all your regular camping gear. And thanks to some supporters, including Algonquin Outfitters that's here today, I've been able to get some pretty light camping gear. But I know Tom fought with that too, and he ended up buying a silk tent in 1913 with some of the money he made off a painting sale, because he was evidently knew there was a lot of weight constrictions too. It's also a study in history. The park, and that's something I've come to realize more and more, and without looking at the First Nation history, and that's another whole interesting subject on its own. It's really looking at from the logging days on is what I've been tracing with this trail, and in particular the time that Tom Thomson was here and he was doing his paintings. And I've come to realize that there was actually an awful lot of people in the park at that time in communities, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. And then lastly, it's a study in nature. It's a chance for me to spend some time and actually call it work, that I can spend time in Algonquin Park in the interior, and when somebody says, Gene, we've got something for you to do, I can say, no, sorry, I've got to go to work. And I can hop in a canoe with a paintbrush and I can head up into the bush and escape with no blackberries or anything. So my plan was to uncover something else about the Thomson story other than what you normally see, because the last thing you need is another book that says well, not the last thing, they'll happen again, but are books on Tom Thomson showing all his paintings. So I wanted to do it from an artist's perspective. I was mainly, am mainly a studio artist. I've always painted some outside, but a lot of my African pieces, I just can't seem to get the animals to cooperate with me, to stand still for me long enough to paint them. So I've decided with this is that this was a chance to explore who I am as an artist. So it's a chance to go and see what he did behind the scenes on all those, like I say, of carrying the wet paintings on all those distances. Doing 150 field paintings, seeing what that does to my own art, how it loosens me up and changes me. From 1912 or 11, when he first started painting, a lot of people don't realize it was such a short time. And then 1912, when he came into the park, if you follow his history of his painting, it changed dramatically over that time period. I'm writing a book on all the experiences. So I've been journaling. I'm actually following Tom Thomson, a lot of rough things that I'm doing, but I've also got an iPad that I take in for journaling. I have all his paintings on it, and I have a little solar panel, solar charger that I take in there. So I've tied the two worlds together and want to add a little weight to my pack too. And then I'm also videoing it. I've got a little GoPro high-definition camera that I've gone on. I've got a canoe mounting. It really makes for great things when you're traveling solo across the lake and people see this guy out on the lake paddling away talking to himself. I've embarrassed myself quite a few times on that one and on the portages, but that's another part of the experience. But then I've already said about the exploring my own art in the park too. This is T Lake Dam, not the same one that Thomson painted many times, but it's in approximately the same place. I've painted a few times now. This is me when I was about 10 or 11 coming to the park. This is that other park. I've been here most of my life. I don't live in the park, but I've certainly spent a lot of time. So I hosted a TV show on art and travel, filmed 2 of the shows in the park. I did some wolf research by helicopter, going down and tagging them, and I've been camping here and feeding deer. You can see at that time back in the 60s, and bears all in the campsites, and now we don't see that too much, but we see lots of moose that I never really saw too much then. This is just an example of some of the advertising. I'm going to show some pictures on the lodges here. These lodges were strategically placed by the CNR, and on top of all the lumber camps and the other science things that were going in through the park, Thomson had access to some of these lodges that were here at the same time as him. Not a lot of evidence of him visiting them. I know he did some guiding through each of them, but I can't imagine when he was traveling through, he liked to dance and he liked to drink, and I know some of the spots where he camped weren't too far from some of these, so I imagine he had access to these as he was traveling through. The top one's Highland Ian that we've talked about on Canoe Lake, where the railway station was, and then they had the stagecoach that went up through to Minising, which is on the bottom right-hand side, right up in another lake on Burnt Island Lake that he canoed and painted right up in that area. And then it's Naminigan on Smoke Lake as well, and Molly Island off in the background that he stayed at a lot. This is his canoe. It's an old antique chestnut canoe. He bought it in 1913 after he sold a painting to the federal government for $500. And you could build a house for about $900. So he wasn't feeling too much pain on the money. And that's when he bought the silk tent as well. And actually today, Brad from the park was nice enough to take me down to the archives, and I got to see his old tent and camping equipment that he had down there. So little does Brad know I left the door open. I'm going to go in and steal it all later. But you'd think he'd lend it to me, being on the journey I'm on. And this is my chestnut. This is my chestnut canoe that I bought, and wouldn't it look nice with a Thomson tent in the front of that? I wanted to have something that tied me in with that part. I have a Swift ultralight Kevlar canoe, but for this journey I want to have this. And this gives you an idea too of all the equipment that I have to take. So I'm going, the first trip I'm going 100 pounds, and then I'm going back and getting all my painting gear that's about 45 pounds, and then the canoe on top of that. So, and Thomson would have had heavier gear at the time in going. Now, I'm 10 years older than Thomson was at 47. He was 33 to 39 in that range when he was here. But it's a lot of equipment, and that's certainly part of the travels that have been, is trying to make that lighten up. So, as I said, my journey began in March of 2012 when the ice was still out. So I was up here pretty early, and I'd never been on Canoe Lake as often as I had been up here. So I walked up the shoreline just to see what it was and see if I could see Mowat Lodge, where he had been, and the areas up in that area. And I decided to go down to the shore just to get my bearings. And when I went down, I thought this nice area, and I thought I'm going to sit down and just do a painting here. It was a nice cloudy day, but there was lots of sun still out there. The ice was partly out on this island. I sat down to do a painting and got all my equipment out, and I thought I should just check my iPad to see if anything looks familiar here. And I started flipping through the iPad, and it turns out I had sat on the exact spot of one of his paintings by accident, just on a 3.5 kilometer walk through the woods, and ended up sitting on one of the spots. That told me right then I was on the right project idea. And I have that on video even, on the thing in my expression when it happened. It was pretty exciting for me. So this is a little dark in the picture, but that's his painting of Canoe Lake on the right and mine on the left. I moved 25 feet to the left, and I ended up on the exact same angle that he was on for that, but still pretty close overall. That's the memorial that was done for Thomson. C.W. Jeffries built all the concrete along with a lot of Canoe Lake residents, and one of the group of 7 members, Arthur Lismer, did all the writing for, or J.H. McDonald, sorry, did the writing on it, and it's been there since 1917. It was a clear hill. It was his favorite campsite, and you could see all over the lake at that time from the logging, as we've talked about before. And now it's solid trees out through there. Very hard to see anything out past it. In 1912, he took this photo of Mowat Cemetery. And then I took this picture in 2012. The fence has been reconstructed, but you can see it's virtually the same other than some rocks that have been moved around over time, but it's still there. And I've been amazed as I go through the park how many little pieces of history are still in the bush that we often overlook, and that you wouldn't even know if you were canoeing up the lake. But if you just go in past those alders at the edge of the bush, there's another whole world of human history in there that we miss. This is the birch tree that's in Mowat Cemetery. And also ironic about that headstone is that he ended up being buried, or may still be buried, at that spot there. And he ended up taking a picture in 1912, and 5 years later he ended up in the cemetery. So kind of an ironic. That's the one part of the journey I've said that I'm not going to repeat. I promised my mother many times, as I don't plan on being there. I'm going to do this as a larger painting at some time, but this is just typical of the little 8x10 sketches that he would have done. And I've been doing these in about a 2-hour maximum. Weather conditions change, and just the clouds move, everything goes in a 2-hour time period. And that was basically what he did, is he had an hour or two that he would do the paintings, and then in the winter he would complete the bigger paintings in the studio. And he did about 300 of them over the time that he was up here until his death in 1917. This is another one. I got caught in a wind on Canoe Lake in early April, and I pulled off, and I got on this little island that I still don't know the name for, and I ended up finding 4 Thomson spots on this island. So whether he got caught there in a wind, or if it was just the fact that there was an easy spot, and a lot of the paintings I found are very practical reasons why he ended up on those spots. You can just see when you go there and you start to look around, it just feels right. And if you're on the island, why paint one if you can paint 4 on the same spot and stay there? So I've done a lot of that I've started to piece things together on how to track down some of his paintings. This one, the angle's not right, but the picture on the left is islands on Canoe Lake, and this is without the trees, and this just shows you how much we've recaptured the nature piece on here. Is that one on the right where I was starting the painting, is there's that many trees on that now that weren't there 100 years ago. So we really have reclaimed the park in a lot of different ways. Makes my job a little more challenging. If I could bring Jamie along with a chainsaw, it might help me on some of those scenes. But This is Mowat Lodge at the time when Thomson was here. It's where he first stayed. It was one of the cheaper places to stay. Gilmore Lumber Company was here, and this was the boarding house for it. And then later on, Shannon Fraser, who they suspect may have killed him, was also a friend of his, took over ownership of it along with his wife Annie. So he stayed here an awful lot, especially in the early spring before you could camp and the ice was still out. So it had a lot of connections with Thomson. And you can still see the site where this was now. That's the village of Mowat on the left. This was Winnie Trainer, that's the place on the right, the cottage. It's still there being used, and all this time later, he was seen to, or she was apparently the lady that he was seeing at the time, and they say may have been having his baby, and that little baby may be somewhere down and through the States, but that's another whole story that I'm not going to talk about today. This is the chip yard that was up at Canoe Lake at the time. It was water filled, and then they threw all the chips and all the old board pieces and everything out onto it, and would basically make a land zone. And when you're canoeing up to this is what it looks like now. And just off to the left, I don't have a picture showing the rest of it. What looks like rocks there is all actually old pieces of lumber and stuff. And that's where the old railway track that went in behind the village of Mowat and goes up by where the cemetery is. And you can, in about a 15-minute jaunt, you can park off to the side and go up and explore all that area. This is Algonquin Hotel. It was right near one of Thomson's favorite painting spots, which was Joe Lake Dam. And I fly fish there now too, and I have to say the fishing's still pretty good there. And luckily Thomson was a fly fisherman, and that was the other great excuse, because I'm a fly fisherman as well, so I can call that work and say, well, it's just part of the story. I have to recreate these. This was literally 5 minutes from that dam, and though I haven't seen any written documents that he spent any time there, other than he guided somebody from there down to Smoke Lake one time, I can't imagine that he wouldn't have spent some time at this place as well. There's still remnants of these buildings up here, and that's what I really start to see more and more, is that if you're a canoeer and you've been exploring nature, is to start taking the time and looking at it from a different perspective, of looking at the human history of the park as well. This is 1950 at 15 in Northway. This again was things that Thomson would have been seeing at the time when we think of him in this vast wilderness, and there was actually all these little pockets of people, in some places where they're not even now. Almost every other lake had a big lumber company or a depot or something on it that he would have had access to be able to stop and have some visits or restock or anything. So on a 6-week trip through there, he could have seen people all the way through, and I think a lot of times we may actually have it more remote now than he did at the time. This is what Minising looks like now. So again, if you just go off into the shoreline, you would not know this is there on Burnt Island Lake, unless you just took that say 6 steps in from the shoreline. And there's all these remnants that are all up through the hill. So it's a pretty fascinating journey if you enjoy history and archaeology. Highland Inn again, we've seen pictures of that. This is one of the things that's left there, is the old hydrant. There was a fire at the Highland Inn one time. It was actually the water tower that started on fire, which I find a bizarre story to that. This is Naminigan. This is Molly Island in behind, one of Thomson's favorite camping spots. And this lodge here, I think he probably went over there and did some painting there and tried to maybe even sell off some of the paintings, have a few drinks, and then would canoe over to Molly Island. And that seems to be typical on a lot of spots. There happens to be an island not too far away from a lodge or a camp that he would have stayed at. So again, I think that's a theme that starts to go on. On the left, again, it's dark, but that's what the lodge looks like now. You don't see anything unless you just take those first few steps in. And there's some of the steps you can take, actually. These are just some old remnants that are around. There's an old post there still with some paint. This is 45 kilometers by canoe up into the bush. And again, right at his time, there was a University of Toronto had a cabin up there, and we're doing research in the park up there. There's also a big lumber camp up at that area too, and you're going to see in a minute something else, is that there actually is alligators in Algonquin Park. And this is one of them that I went on this trip just to see. Thomson had painted an alligator in 1916, I believe it was. So I did a journey, instead of going to the canoe museum that's nice and close, or the logging museum, I decided I'd go on a week-long trip to see this one instead. Almost didn't find it. It's even from 10 feet out in the water, you don't see it. And it was just on shore. But if you just dig in, I've talked to numerous people that haven't found it when they've been up there. And it was just sheer determination that I had canoed and told everybody I was going to find that alligator, that I wasn't leaving without tailing an alligator and getting it. So I did a little painting of that in the afternoon too. On the left is and one of the anchors that they would have used for the alligator. What they were is to pull log booms across the lakes, and then when they got to land, they could actually pull themselves up over land and into the next lake, and hence the name Alligator came in. The company's actually right here in Simcoe, Ontario, was where they were manufactured. There's very few of them left now. That's my antique painting box that I found, similar to Thomson's as well. Unfortunately, the Algonquin Center wouldn't lend me a painting box either, or the tent. And that's just one of my little paintings that I did on site as well on the right-hand side. And this is where I was talking about some of the realities that started to take place, was the hardships of everything, but also was the number of communities, logging companies, lodges, and everything in at the time. And that's that human piece of the history. Human piece, the history and Thomson intertwine on the two that we often don't think about, but also just that when we're going up camping, and I think it was 1954, they made a declaration that they were going to make the park back into a natural place. And they took all these buildings out of here. But they did leave a lot of little remnants in, and they're all spread through the park. Sometimes it's foundations. There's even a shanty on Big Trout Lake. There's a foundation of an old shanty, one of the logger shanties. So if a person loves history, you can have another whole end of going in and enjoying Algonquin Park. Thomsons, as I've said, Thomsons Art and the park and history to me are totally intertwined now, so they've got me hooked on both ways. In fact, some of the times I've got in trouble because I've spent less time painting and more time exploring, and I'm behind about 10 paintings from my schedule now, and I blame that on a lot of these old remnants, so I've got some catching up. He did a lot of painting in the fall, so luckily I've got some time to catch up. In the spring also, he painted a lot of snow scenes, and I came up here and I found a little patch of snow was all I could find, so I wasn't too happy with that, so I'm hoping next year we get some less global warming and more snow. Success of the park management and the importance of not losing the park's human history. These books that are up here, actually, I have all of them, and I've used them for a lot of the reference. They're all great books and available in the bookstore here. New way of looking at and exploring the park, both from a paint end, history end, and still the nature piece. Enjoyment of finding hidden treasures. You can't take them if you find them. They're historical documents of the parks, but you can certainly look at them. It takes lots of pictures. And then the last part is even if they're not great paintings, pick up a paintbrush and just go back and try something. I always say they only have to be good enough to make you want to do one more. So if you're not planning on doing what I'm doing, or you're not looking at doing it professionally, just go up and let you sit on a spot for 10 minutes or so, or 10 minutes or so. I'm looking at the schedule. It lets you look at it, sit for two. Boy, if I can do a painting in 10 minutes, I'm really on my way. It lets you sit for a few hours onto a spot, and you learn more about an area sitting and doing that one painting, even if it doesn't turn out, than you'll ever learn from doing or taking 100 photos of that same spot. There's something very organic about sitting and doing that painting process, and I'm sure that's one of the things that really drew Thomson to the park 100 years ago, was that when that got into his blood, not just the park itself, as we've talked about, and the love for it, but also that piece of being able to almost join. His new video called West Wind that's out, is they speak in that about that Thomson and the park have almost become one. And I've really seen how that can happen, because I may not be able to take the park away from Thomson, but I hope I have a little footnote that involves me in there, because I'm certainly on an enjoyable journey right now. And that's my talk, so I'd like to thank you all for having me here today and listening.